Before FromSoftware was known as the Souls studio, they were known as the Armored Core guys. While mecha games have slowly been gaining a renewed popularity within the video gaming space in the last several years, it was once a booming subgenre through the late 90s to early 2000s. Not only was Armored Core a big part of that popularity, it was also joined by other big franchises, like Konami's Metal Gear Solid and Zone of the Enders, Square's Front Mission, Sega's Virtual On, and the long-running MechWarrior series. There were also periodic single releases or short-lived franchises, like Shogo Mobile Armor Division, Steel Battalion, and other FromSoft mecha games, Metal Wolf Chaos, Another Century's Episode, Murakumo, and later, Chrome Hounds. From the mid-2000s onward, there was a somewhat dramatic fall-off for mecha video games, as they suddenly became few and far between. There were games that weren't necessarily focused on mechs that still had the option to control some, like Command & Conquer, Supreme Commander, and Battlefield 2142. Please give us a sequel, I am begging. But once the decade turned around and we reached the mid-2010s and on, things slowly started to look up again, with games like Hawken, Titanfall 1 and 2, Battletech, Iron Harvest, Demon Ex Machina, 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim, MechWarrior 5, several more indie and AA titles, and of course, numerous Gundam games, especially the Versus series. And even more recently, Square Enix has begun releasing remakes of early Front Mission titles. Things are looking up once again for mecha media. But why stop there? Why not have one more huge return to the scene? Not with a reboot, remake, or remaster, but with a new numbered entry. FromSoftware announced Armored Core 6: Fires of Rubicon at the Game Awards 2022, after a very passionate presentation from Jeff Keighley, who honestly sounded like he was exasperated with excitement before the revealed trailer started. And why wouldn't he be? It was a CG trailer, yes, but it was one that very clearly pitched the tone and direction the game would be in, and it was a pitch that succeeded. Longtime fans of the series and prospective new fans who had recently become infatuated with the studio now had their eyes locked on the return of one of the legendary OG mecha titles. An Armored Core game made with the same amount of resources as Elden Ring, or at least Sekiro. What old school fan wouldn't want such a thing? And for those who hadn't played any of the prior games before, what kind of nutcase would turn their nose up at a big-budget, high-speed mecha game from the creators of Dark Souls? With FromSoft's continued growth and the unprecedented success of Elden Ring, now is the time to remind the world that Armored Core is still here. 11.5 years since Armored Core 5 and nearly 10 years since Verdict Day, it's time for the Ravens to fly once again. I've purchased the game, I've completed it, 3 times to be exact, and now it's time to talk about it. So without any further delay, let's begin the review of Armored Core 6. Armored Core 6 takes place in the far future, where humanity has mastered interstellar travel and developed civilizations far from Earth. On the planet named Rubicon 3, an enigmatic substance called coral is discovered. Considered a desirable resource for multiple purposes, coral is hailed as the key to furthering humanity's technological advancement. Unfortunately, human greed pushed the results of this discovery into catastrophic territory. Not long after, a massive disaster called the Fires of Ibis occurs, where vicious flames engulfed not only the surface of Rubicon 3, but the rest of the surrounding star system as well. 50 years after this event, new signs of coral's existence has popped up once again, and ruthlessly pragmatic megacorporations have begun to flock to the planet once more to drain the substance from it, showing little care towards the few inhabitants still living there. Multiple mercenary companies hired by these corporations continue an endless conflict over the control of coral, with Rubiconian resistance forces attempting to drive all of them out. And on top of that, independent mercenaries seeking fame and fortune constantly throw their own hats into the ring as well. The player is one of those independents, designated C4621, who serves the infamous handler Walter. After 621 illegally enters Rubicon 3 and obtains a license from an already fallen mercenary, they must enter the seemingly endless series of battles between companies to obtain fame and fortune of their own. But eventually, a side must be chosen, and some way, somehow, the conflict must end. As with FromSoft's last several games, their approach to storytelling is through somewhat sparse amounts of dialogue that feature usually just the most essential expository detail that provide just enough context to be impactful if you pick up on it immediately. Anything more than that will need to be parsed by the player through inference, reading descriptions of things, and adding up different variables. But one thing is obvious from the get-go. The world of Armored Core 6 is a bleak, dreary, violent, and coldly apathetic place. One strong, consistent theme that's been present within the franchise since pretty much day one is how much of a dystopian, conflict-driven hellhole human civilization has become, ruled by a merciless, hyper-militarized state that sees people as biological assets instead of human beings, and funded by uncaring megacorporations that look only for the next method of making another dollar. Fires of Rubicon spares no effort in continuing this horrific setting, and even the flashy combat cannot hide how oppressive and misanthropic this universe is. Inhabiting it, however, is a solid variety of characters with distinct personalities. Every character in the game is either a voice communicating through mail or radio, or a voice communicating from the inside of their own armored core. No one is present in their human form, and that's a detail that adds to the bleak atmosphere of this world, but also takes advantage of the situation by allowing characters to have visual personality through their armored cores. Their weapons, their body, and even their designation, AC name, and emblem. Characters in this game may not have a face to their name, but they still receive so much visual representation regardless that it doesn't really matter. The main cast isn't particularly large, but even without their symbols and emblems, they are distinct from one another, not only between individuals, but between factions. You have the boisterous and loud men from Balaam Industries, who resemble hardened, gung-ho military personnel. You have the more calm, frigid attitudes of several members of Arquebus Corporation, who feel closer to stone-cold assassins than anything else. But even among all the rabble, there's still some standout characters, like Rusty, who is basically the only person working for these corporations that treats you with any friendliness at all, and Cinder Carla, the sharp-tongued engineer. Then of course you have Handler Walter, the stoic man giving you all of your missions. His inner thoughts are hard to gauge, but if you pay close enough attention, you can take a guess as to how he feels about the story's toughest decisions. One aspect of the Souls series and Elden Ring is their almost abnormally brilliant voice acting, and it was something I had hoped would carry over into Fires of Rubicon without much trouble. While there are quite a few characters who possess great personality and presence without sounding too much like cartoon characters, some of them feel like they were ripped straight out of a shonen anime dub, and it takes a second to get used to. That's not to say that it's an inherently bad thing. If anything, it makes certain characters stand out even more. It just might be a surprise if you're expecting voice direction and delivery closer to that of Souls games. Now, let's talk graphics and performance. Armored Core 6 has an absolutely stunning eye for scale. Once you reach a certain level of immersion in the combat, you sort of tune out environmental details like vehicles and stuff. Because of this, it's sometimes easy to forget you're piloting a mech that stands at a minimum of 10 meters in height. It's not until you stop and stand next to a car and actually compare sizes that you remember how big you are. But in spite of this, the mission areas you roam around in still feel quite huge, even though they're closed in and surrounded by invisible walls. You fly through absolutely gargantuan superstructures that can be seen from space, and there's more seen off in the distance during other missions where you're outdoors. It creates a very impressive and jaw-dropping visual that serves as a powerful reminder as to how far technology has come in this setting. What's also really badass about the game's art direction is the appearance of armored cores and their equipment. So many weapons and body parts boast an eye-catching form and level of detail. You may find yourself gravitating towards something without even looking at its stats. There's so many ways to make your AC look cool as fuck, and it's not limited to the actual parts. There's also a pretty robust cosmetics system that allows you to paint specific areas of your AC's body, as well as apply a different amount of wear and tear for either a squeaky clean or busted up appearance. And you can even make custom emblems and place them anywhere on the body, and even share them with people on the same platform. I've seen some people say Armored Core 6 is like the Gran Turismo of mecha games, and I can see why. I would lean closer to Need for Speed in this simile, but the spirit of the statement is more or less accurate. There's enough to satisfy those who want good customization, but not so much that it would put off the more casual players. Messing around in the garage is almost like a digital version of putting together and painting Gunpla in your own little studio. And finally, there's the visuals of combat. Gameplay is super fast and flashy. When a battle begins, explosions are going off constantly. Bullets are flying by non-stop, and lasers and plasma are blasting everything in sight. Particle effects are thus super strong, but also vibrant and distinctive. It's possible to know exactly what kind of weapon your opponent is using just by the particle effects it has. On top of that, the game's interface is also very stylized without sacrificing readability. The HUD looks sufficiently sci-fi-ish, but one of the cooler details is when you lock onto an enemy, and meters on the left and right side of the aiming reticle let you know how much ammunition you have before you'll need to reload, as well as how long your reload is taking. You have this very important information that you can visually receive without needing to take your eyes off the target. It's such a small thing, but I find it extremely helpful. And the detail doesn't stop there. You can even distinguish which in-game manufacturer made the boosters you're using just by the color of their flame. It's very clear that the art team busted their ass for this game, and it paid off. I played the PlayStation 5 version of the game, and was none too surprised to see a pretty simple and straightforward selection of performance modes. The usual quality mode and frame rate mode. The good news here is that the visual difference between the two modes is minimal. It's fairly clear that quality mode is at a higher resolution, but overall graphical fidelity does not experience any significant drop when switching to frame rate mode. If you want to actually notice any real change when going back and forth between them, you'll probably need to be standing still in-game, leaning forward in your seat, and probably squinting a bit. The difference really is that small. While you're actually playing, that is, boosting around constantly, spraying bullets and lasers all over the place, and focusing on staying alive, the change may as well be non-existent. You're not going to pay any real attention to the slightly blurrier shadows while you truly engage with the gameplay. And speaking of gameplay, during missions there is no ray tracing to speak of, regardless of the mode you're on. However, you do have the option to enable it exclusively inside the garage, where you'll be mixing and matching all sorts of weapons and AC body parts. FromSoft's ray tracing approach isn't as robust as some other studios, but I do think that enabling it makes the visual of your AC standing menacingly in the garage much more atmospheric. Regarding frame rates, well, the answer is pretty obvious. Frame rate mode manages to stay pretty high. I don't think it ever dropped below 50 frames per second or so, no matter how chaotic a battle may have been. In quality mode, the frame rate seems to hover around 40 frames per second, with rare approaches to mid-30s when stuff gets really crazy. With all of this in mind, I can definitely recommend just playing the game in frame rate mode because there's hardly any sacrifice in visual fidelity to speak of, and the gameplay will look and feel more consistent. Also relating to performance is loading times, and this is a pretty short point to touch on because, to the surprise of no one, the PS5 version's load times are excellent. The game has a loading screen, yes, but it's never in front of me for more than maybe 6 seconds. We're near the end of year 3 of the generation and I'm still enjoying how fast games load. I sincerely appreciate saving time on loading so I can recycle those saved seconds back into actual gameplay. Music has played an important part of the presentation of FromSoft's games for a long time. For Fires of Rubicon, Kota Hoshino, who has been part of the Armored Core team since the first game back in 1999, returns yet again to compose the score, and what a solid collection of tracks it is. He expertly combines elements of orchestral and synth sounds to produce very powerful songs that range from dreary and droning to energetic and intense. Some tracks even have an element of jazz. For someone who has been working as a composer for the franchise for so damn long, it's no wonder at all that he's keenly aware of what fitting music for it is, and his score absolutely elevates the gameplay experience, as any good video game score should do. Now, let's finally get to the meat and potatoes of any game review: the gameplay. First, let's discuss the structure of the game. For people with no experience with Armored Core, but lots of experience with Souls or Elden Ring, it may come as a surprise that this game is not open world, nor does it have interconnected Metroidvania-style levels. It's a mission-based format, meaning you have a central hub, your garage, and you pick a new mission, get dropped into the appropriate area, and complete your objectives. When you're done, you go back to your hub and do it all again. This is how the series has always operated, and it's a format that really leans towards its strengths, goals, and narrative. You spend time in your garage, tuning and customizing your Armored Core to suit the needs of your next mission, then you deploy, and either succeed with flying colors, or get obliterated and sent back to the drawing board. Missions also vary greatly in scope and length. One mission, you're taking only about 60 seconds or so mopping up a bunch of low-rank losers in a random part of the map, and the next mission, you're spending 20 minutes scaling a 250-meter mobile base to take down a gigantic defense laser. Fires of Rubicon does not leave much for wanting when it comes to objective variety. And in typical FromSoft fashion, some of these missions even boast some incredible opportunities for awe-striking cinematic moments without feeling like it's on rails. And before we get too far ahead to mention this, the game does a more than adequate job getting you prepared for all of this action. Tutorials in AC6 are pretty strong, and the game verbally reminds you that you also have an incentive to do the tutorials because completing them unlocks extra AC parts. There's also an AC test mode, which is basically a training room where you can spawn certain types of enemies, enable or disable their AI, and practice your build for as long as you want without committing to a mission. And when I say customization is important, I truly mean it. For those who haven't played any AC game yet, I'll break it down for you. First is the number of components. The actual Armored Core's body is divided into head, arms, body, and legs, and each part has their own weight, health, and other stats that may be unique to them. Legs are a particularly interesting area, because you're not limited to just the bipedal form. You also have a four-legged selection which grants the ability to hover for an extended period of time. And more still, you also have the option for tank legs, or tank treads, which offer a massive amount of health, longevity, and a higher equip rate at the sacrifice of speed and coverage when boosting. There's a huge selection of body parts to mix and match for a form you think looks the coolest, or works the best for the mission you're about to hop into. Now, you have two sets of 2 weapons, meaning 4 in total. A right and left hand weapon, and a right and left back weapon. Hand weapons are typically your primary source of firepower, rifles, pistols, shotguns, and more, whereas your back weapons are typically for support, missiles, cannons, and shields. I use the word typically because once you get far enough into the game, you can basically turn these expectations on their head and really do whatever the hell you want. For example, there's one AC OS upgrade called the weapon bay that lets you replace each back weapon with another hand weapon that you can simply switch to on the fly by pressing their respective fire button. I've seen multiple people take advantage of this, specifically with melee-focused builds. But otherwise, you can just waltz around firing 4 guns at once. And no, you don't need to adopt that fucked up backwards claw grip on your controller to do it. Generally speaking, almost any weapon equipable on the right hand can also go on the left, and vice versa, with the only exception being melee weapons and a couple defensive explosive weapons. Those are exclusive to the left hand. The same goes for the back. Anything you can put on the right back can also be put on the left, except shields. Shields stay on the left. With this system, there's a massive amount of potential weapon combinations. You can have something different in each slot, or go all in and put cannons and missiles all over your body. You can be a jack of all trades with a small answer to everything, or you can be the king of gimmicks. It's all up to you. Assembly still doesn't stop there. After body parts and weapons, you have boosters, FCS, and generators. Boosters affect thrust speed, including quick boost. Some are focused on vertical thrust so you can ascend faster. Others focus on quick boosting so you can zoom around and deftly avoid all kinds of attacks. Others focus on assault boost, which is how you close distance very quickly, like a sprint. FCS, or Fire Control System, affects targeting. This is an interesting little mechanic because it directly influences lock-on effectiveness. Soft lock-on is always enabled, and is generally what you want to use when dealing with larger groups of fodder. But when the occasion arrives that you need to use a hard lock-on in order to keep an enemy in your sights as much as possible, FCS comes into play. This component controls how fast your AC can lock onto enemies at varying distances, close range, mid-range, or long range, displayed by the red reticle. The faster the FCS is at a specific distance, the sooner that reticle will be directly over the enemy. Depending on the weapons you use, you'll want to equip an FCS that is appropriate for their ideal range. Generators do pretty much what you think they do. Control your energy gauge, and not just the duration, but how fast it cools down. All of these parts work together to make your AC build, and you'd be surprised at how every stat can make or break a very specific loadout you could be going for. It's important to know what every piece of information is, because neglecting a stat that seems innocuous might be the thing that cripples your efficiency. And the game does anticipate you making big changes to your build on a mission-to-mission basis, especially if you don't land on a strong one early on. More on that later. It really does take mere seconds to go back into assembly and switch things around. The game was very obviously made with the expectation of players modifying their builds constantly. You can even do it right after you die, just before you reload the last checkpoint. Now let's get to the fun part, putting the build to use in combat. Mech fights have seen a wide variety in pace in video games throughout the years, from the more hard sci-fi approach of slow, lumbering metal behemoths firing missiles and Gatling guns from considerable distances, to bare-knuckle brawls. But Armored Core has always been known for its ridiculous speed. It doesn't matter if you're piloting a machine that weighs 20 to 40 tons, it can zoom around at breakneck speeds as much as it wants. And this makes for some satisfying and kick-ass experiences in combat. No matter what your build is, you'll be busy hitting those shoulder buttons and slamming that quick boost. Super light builds can turn the screen into an ugly smear while you speed around, and tanky builds can almost stand still and ruin the enemy's day. Speaking of boosting, there's one important tidbit of information to know about it that might come as a shock to people coming from Souls and Elden Ring. Quick boosting is for dodging, yes, but it's not like rolling. Quick boosting actually does not have invincibility frames, meaning timing does not matter as much as placement. When a dodge has iframes, your hurtbox can overlap the attack's hitbox completely, but you'll still be fine so long as the dodge is at the right moment and the iframes last longer than the attack's active frames, making it a pass-fail system. Iframeless dodging, however, is not so consistent. It takes a lot more practice and even faster reflexes to reliably avoid attacks with this type of dodge, especially when it comes to explosions. In fact, there will be times where your reflexes are perfect, but the dodge itself does not take you far enough from the area of effect, so you're destined to get hit anyway. All of this translates into, the longer a fight lasts, the harder it becomes. Fires of Rubicon is a very offensive-focused game, and keeping up aggression while also staying alive and managing resources can make things quite challenging. You have to wisely spend energy, because emptying the meter at a bad time can spell a sudden and disastrous end for you. You have to make sure you're not blindly spraying and praying all the time as well, because ammo is not unlimited. Granted, for a lot of guns, ammo is still quite plentiful, and there are some missions where you're allowed to resupply. But under the right conditions, you can find yourself barehanded by the time a mission is over, and you'll have to finish it with just your fists. There's a number of different enemy types that you'll encounter throughout the game, ranging from fodder that you can eliminate in an instant no matter what weapon you're wielding, all the way to hard-assed bosses that you'll spend hours on if you don't know what works. What really matters is that there's a mostly consistent level of entertainment to have no matter where on the spectrum your enemy rests. No matter who you're up against, fights are flashy, kinetic, involving, and very satisfying once you've hit your stride and clicked with how everything works. There is no greater feeling than starting a mission, decimating everything in your way with precision and efficiency, and ending it with barely a scratch on you. It makes you feel like a true blue hardened mercenary worthy of fear and respect. FromSoftware has undoubtedly proven that they can still make incredible combat systems beyond what we've been seeing in the Souls games that sent their popularity rocketing since 2009. They haven't forgotten what makes Armored Core great, no matter the scenario you're playing. It's extremely fun to burn through dozens of nameless mooks, and it's extremely fun to go one-on-one with another badass in a cool AC. And you also have the monsters. The big, hulking colossi that are less like armored cores and more like giant beasts that just so happen to be mechanical. This is where the conversation about combat becomes complicated, and people start to air their grievances. But I don't think it's necessarily a problem caused by just the bosses. If anything, their fights are symptoms of a different, but not super huge problem. Let me explain. During the opening days of AC6's launch, it became very apparent that a non-insignificant group of players were finding themselves stonewalled by bosses. Not the enemy armored cores, but those massive robotic monsters. It was kind of funny at first, pointing and laughing at people thoughtlessly lashing out about the difficulty of these fights before they fully understood how to play. I saw all the jokes and memes about the helicopter and Balteus being filters who exposed the Get Good squad migrating from Souls and Elden Ring for how scrubby they actually are. As someone who always thought that the mindless spewing of the Get Good phrase was just online posturing for useless gamer cred, it was honestly quite amusing. People were missing very obvious context clues for how to beat Balteus, for example, when the game unlocked a shield-destroying weapon, then had you fight an enemy AC who used that weapon against you to show its effectiveness, all before having you fight a huge boss that used shields. But more days passed, and I began to notice more of a pattern among people who did manage to beat those supposedly problematic boss encounters. Almost all of them were using builds within the same small pool of weapons. I watched a lot of gameplay footage on Twitter, YouTube, and even Reddit, and I saw a lot of dual shotguns, especially Zimmerman's, dual laser cannons, dual Gatling guns, dual needle launchers, dual songbirds, or equally damaging grenade launchers, and a lot of pile bunkers for melee builds. It doesn't seem like that small of a pool until you notice that entire other weapon classes are left out. Where's the assault rifles, the submachine guns, the pistols? Where's most of the other missile launchers and back weapons? Whether it's Bolteus, Sea Spider, or other bosses later in the game, it seems like a huge chunk of players have found themselves gravitating towards a specific group of super hard-hitting weapons. Why? It's not like other weapons are totally useless. I've cleared missions with dual ducats before, so why does everyone seem to default to these other specific firearms? It's easy for some people to simply start blaming the bosses, but as I said, they're only a symptom. The actual issue is a combination of two key factors: weapon balance and how the stagger mechanic works. Those two aspects of the game working in tandem create quite a huge chasm separating the strongest, most viable weapons from everything else. Sure, damn near every weapon can take care of trash mobs, mid-level enemies, and even mini-bosses without too much issue, but those huge brutes, like Sea Spider and others, shake up the viability of weapons by a lot, and it's because of how important the stagger mechanic is for dispatching them. You see, weapons have different levels of stagger damage and health damage, and of course, when you stagger an enemy, your damage output jumps up by a considerable amount. Meaning, if you want to make any fight easier, especially these harder bosses, then you will need to take advantage of weapons that put them in stagger immediately, and melt their health bar while they're down. Because of these details, the game ends up throwing all the power into the laps of the extremely high-impact weapons with massive burst damage potential. Sustained fire and damage from machine guns and assault rifles don't really matter as much, except to prevent the stagger meter from emptying too quickly. But even that isn't too much of an issue so long as you get into the enemy's face before you pull the trigger. Thus, assault rifles, submachine guns, and pistols get massively deprioritized in favor of dual shotguns, cannons, and grenade launchers. Those are the weapons that can put any boss in stagger within seconds and annihilate their health bar afterward. And you want that because, as I mentioned earlier, the longer the fight goes on, the harder it becomes. And these weapons don't do that only to bosses either. They do that to everyone, meaning that these are the weapons that can carry you through the entire game with ease. And once you start using them, it is extremely difficult to stop, because they are such efficient and devastating problem solvers, to the point where assault rifles and submachine guns feel like they don't even need to exist because their own strengths are nowhere close to being strong enough to close this viability gap. FromSoftware has always had issues with nutty weapon balance during the first weeks or months of their new games. I probably don't need to remind you about the Moonveil, Rivers of Blood, and Hoarfrost Stomp era immediately following the launch of Elden Ring. Now, I would expect these powerful meta weapons to get a bit nerfed once balance patches start to come out, but I would much rather see the weaker weapons buffed instead. They do not need to be as strong as the meta weapons are now, but they definitely need a bump in viability for boss fights so that there is no longer a huge canyon of a gap between them and dual Zimmermans. For example, the pistols need a huge increase to ammo capacity. I feel like I spend way too much time reloading them for the damage they do. They, and basically all other rifles and machine guns, also need a small bump to fire rate and projectile speed, and maybe a small bump to both stagger and health damage too. Rifles also need an increase in ideal range, because true long-range sniping doesn't seem to be a thing in this game at all. I'm sure there's a few people who think they're playing the so-called correct way by purposely gimping themselves with undertuned weapons, but if a fair amount of non-meta weapons feel like wet noodles in comparison to the meta ones, I think some balance changes are needed. Again, this does not mean non-meta weapons are totally useless. They still function reliably in any mission that doesn't have a huge boss. If anything, I'd actually recommend making a fun non-meta build your default one, and only saving a meta build for when the going gets tough. The game gives so much favor to shotguns and explosive ordnance because of the hectic combat where close-range burst damage reigns supreme. So while the game is still extremely fun and build variety is still very strong, weapon stats could use another pass or two, as more of the available arsenal seems like it's underperforming than overperforming. Speaking of meta builds, let's finally touch on multiplayer, which is pretty damn straightforward. Once you progress through the game far enough, you'll unlock the ability to participate in 1v1 or 3v3 player versus player battles. You can take whatever builds you want in there, meaning you can expect as many dual Zimmermans in there as you see in videos of people doing story missions with them. However, if you're willing to fight AI armored cores, you can experience a great variety of enemy builds in the single-player arena, which is a totally different mode where you're rewarded money and operating system chips for defeating NPC opponents based on actual characters in the game. Don't let the fact that they're NPCs fool you. Some of these guys pack a serious punch and will knock you on your ass, assuming you're not using a stupidly strong meta build yourself. And unfortunately, PvP is the only online mode the game boasts at the moment. And this is probably my biggest complaint with the game. There's no co-op. A current-day, fast-paced mecha game with huge bosses, and it doesn't have any co-op content to speak of. I know I might be sounding a bit unreasonable and selfish, but man, it feels like such a waste to not have some kind of team-based stuff to do. Maybe FromSoft has plans to add it in later. I can only hope. Now, let's discuss what you can do after the game is over. That's right, it's time to touch on replayability. And as luck would have it, Armored Core 6 is the most easily replayable game FromSoft has made in over a decade, and I mean that in multiple ways. First off, there's the fact that you can replay missions. When you complete a mission, it's available to replay permanently, even in New Game Plus. This is great for a number of reasons. It gives you a way to improve your performance for each mission and even gives you a grade at the end. It lets you collect any battle logs you might have missed and increase your hunter rank to unlock more parts. And most importantly, for you money farmers out there, replaying missions gives you the same amount of cash as it did when you first played it. Another more implied use for this is testing out new builds on the field. Yes, there is an AC test feature that I mentioned earlier where you can try out your new loadout in a controlled environment, but sometimes you want to take your workout for a spin in the real danger. And early game missions are actually perfect for that, as they're short and sweet, and as I said, you still get money for them. I also mentioned New Game Plus a second ago, and I'm sure it's something that even non-Armored Core fans have grown to expect from FromSoftware. Every Souls game has had some form of New Game Plus, but most of them have been pretty minimal regarding actual changes, opting to just bump up enemy health and attack values for the sake of a consistent challenge. Dark Souls 2 had the most robust New Game Plus thanks to new enemy placements, but Fires of Rubicon goes above and beyond all those examples. With its totally different mission-based structure, it has the opportunity to do some interesting things, and it capitalizes on that. This is not a game where the experience ends once the credits roll. New Game Plus not only has new missions to do and new AC parts and weapons to acquire, it has entirely new story elements. And it doesn't stop there. New Game Plus Plus, that's your third playthrough, has even more new missions and more unique plot details, and it's the only way to acquire the third ending for the game. I said near the beginning of the review that I completed the game 3 times, and it's not just because I enjoy it, it's because I had to in order to receive the full breadth of the narrative. Unlike most other games with New Game Plus, it's not just a thing you decide to do for the sake of it in Armored Core 6, it's basically mandatory. The New Game Plus combat experience is also incredible. Going through early missions with all the best weapons and parts, and all the OS upgrades beefing up damage and defense is ridiculously satisfying. You are just trashing everything while still getting some pleasant surprises in the form of new encounters exclusive to the mode. Overall, Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon is a fun, impressive game. The setting is bleak, desolate, and oppressive, but also beautiful and well realized. The characters are distinct and have personality despite technically being faceless the entire game. The action performs pretty solidly in regard to resolution and frame rate for both of its performance modes. The music is really nice, AC customization is very robust, combat is fast and satisfying, and the game gives ample reason to replay it over and over again. If there's any shortcomings to speak of, it's current meta-heavy weapon balance, which can be easily solved with a few patches over time, and an unfortunate lack of co-op. FromSoftware has effectively brought Armored Core back in a big, successful way. And they probably picked the most ideal time to do it. Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro have helped elevate their popularity over the course of 13 years, but it was the more recent success of Elden Ring that turned them into a damn near household name with well over 20 million copies sold. That's a number comparable to games in the Pokemon and Call of Duty franchises. That's a really fucking huge deal. And it was the best possible platform for Armored Core to launch a revival from after nearly 10 years since the release of Verdict Day. The potential future for this series looks very bright as of right now, and I absolutely trust FromSoft to take advantage of its newfound momentum and steer it down a promising path. Furthermore, I hope the success of Fires of Rubicon convinces other companies to come back to or newly contribute their own games in the mecha sphere. In addition to their remakes of earlier games, I would love a AAA return of Front Mission, a real one, not left alive, or a return of Steel Battalion. And I don't think I need to iterate how great Titanfall 3 would be. And let's not forget FromSoft's other mecha properties, Metal Wolf Chaos and Chrome Hounds. I'd kill to have those back too. We could be witnessing the dawn of a new golden age of mecha games. Let's keep our fingers crossed. This concludes my review of Armored Core 6. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.